Get away from that. Hello, 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 hello. One, two, three, four. Hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello. I mean, it's a little bit, but ain't much you can do about it because there's no light on him.
It's okay.
But he's
It's not
okay.
as bad as I thought it was.
He's all right.
Okay.
And if you want to get really fancy, you can actually download the app.
Oh, really? Do we have a stand for the phone?
Huh?
Do we have a stand for our phone?
We can put one on a stand.
You know where Floyd is?
He's outside. He's doing his slow-mo project.
We might need to use a Sony because I think the camera's too heavy for the gimbal.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Inside the thing's unlocked.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah, closet's unlocked, so you can just, in my room, so you can just take that one. Which I have to actually have to do that. You're good?
Do you just download that Steam Studio app and
Yep.
connect it?
Yeah.
Is that simple?
Yeah. I don't, because when you kids have an iPhone, I don't know if it works on Android, that's why. But I have a stand if you want, that'll go on a tripod. You need it.
was select to audio followed video. We don't want that.
You want that other
Right.
one?
Audio mixer.
The one you wanted, Mom? Is that the one? No, that's the
We've got Mr. Mark Youngs, our CFO for KCAL-A ISD here today. He's got some special guests with him as well, and he's going to explain the process. Very many people get exposed to this, so this is really cool for you all. Again, make sure your cell phones are put away. Get excited about this. This is going to be really, really cool today. Without any further ado, Mr. Mark Youngs, everybody.
Shares in companies and stocks get traded daily. Bonds get traded daily. The bond market is a $4 trillion in value market, and it's debt that's owned by corporations and entities like municipalities, cities, counties, and school districts that sell bonds to generate dollars to pay for buildings. So we want this morning's exercise to be interactive. To make sure everybody heard it, we're live streaming it, recording it. It's going to be posted on YouTube when we're done. We shouldn't take much. They help us structure our debt, plan our debt, make sure it's sustainable inside of the tax rate that we've adopted. Chris Settle is here from Call Parkhurst Law Firm. He's our bond counsel. Underwriters that help them to actually sell the bonds to companies, retirement funds that actually purchase the bonds on the day we went to sale. And you're going to see the bond sale day in 5-minute increments. We sold $315 million of bonds in 90 minutes. And you're going to see that happen in 5-minute increments with a little. This is what my responsibilities are in the school district. We look after accounting, financial reporting. You can read it faster than I can say it. At the bottom of the slide, it says, my management philosophy is to be invisible. That means the buses run on time, lunch gets served on time, payroll happens without the educators having to worry about anything, so they can worry about educating you and making sure that happens. We serve 25,000 meals a day. Some of them are served right over. The last time we did a bond election was 5 years ago, and these are the projects that we did. Part of it was remodeling Keller High School. How many of you are from Keller High? Some of you? Cool new school. We built Elementary 23. We think that might be our final elementary. The 2020 bond took care of these projects, and you can see we're going to be replacing 4 elementaries that are 40 years old. We're going to do major remodels on Keller Middle and Fossil Hill Middle and some of these other projects. The Ag Science Center at the bottom is going out near the freeway on Golden Triangle. That's an ancillary building to this building. It's going to have veterinary and some agri-science out there. So let me pause there and ask if there's any questions. We doing all right so far? All right. We spend our money in the general fund mainly. That's about $300 million a year. $64 million is debt service. That's principal and interest on our bonds. Another 15 in food service. Other funds like grants are another 11. So we're about a $400 million business in the Keller School District. Now, House Bill 3 passed a year ago, and I thought I'd share with you how much revenue per pupil Keller has before and after House Bill 3. So if you look at revenue per pupil, there's some districts that we compare ourselves to on the left, their enrollment, how much revenue they get in the general fund, and then how much revenue per pupil. The column out to the far right is how much revenue we would have if we had that other district's funding. So if we were funded like HEB, we'd lose almost $11 million. But at the bottom of that, you can see the Carrollton Farmers Branch, Property Wealthy District. If we had their funding, we'd have another $75 million. So one of the common misperceptions in school finance in Texas is that all the districts are funded the same. They are not. If you remember, in the fall of 18, we did a tax ratification election, which was followed in the spring of 19 with House Bill 3. That changed our fortunes considerably. We are a lot better off than we used to be. You can see the differential. We're still not as funded as well as some others, but we're a whole lot better than we used to be. This is a little history of the two tax rates that drive our business. Your parents, when they pay their mortgage, are paying some property tax. That tax for the school has two pieces, M&O, or maintenance and operating tax. INS is interest and sinking, and the sinking just means principal. It's interest and principal. And so you can see the history of those two tax rates. The M&O rate have any questions that you'd like to ask. So those are the House rules, okay? Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Youngs. Before I get started, my name is Jeff Robert with Hilltop Securities, and I've had the opportunity and honor and privilege to work with Keller ISD since 2002. Not sure what you guys were doing in 2002, but I remember working with Keller way back when. And since then, we've done over $850 million in bond elections since then. And it's been a long time since I was in your seat as a high school junior or high school senior, but I recall after starting this job that, I went from class to class and didn't really think of anything about the facilities that I was going to school in. And then I started this job and realized that the process we're discussing today is how every facility that you've entered throughout your career here at Keller High School or any other public school district is the process that other districts have gone through in order for the facilities to be built. And believe it or not, I also learned that people move into certain areas like Keller ISD because of the schools and the school system and the successes that Keller ISD has had. So I'm going to jump kind of between pre-election or bond election processes and then post-bond election processes leading up to the pricing, and then I'll turn it over to Chris Settle to talk about the legalities, and then Kit and Keith will talk about the actual pricing. But just kind of a bonds 101 thing. It's a good question. What is a school bond? What does that even mean? And Mr. Young had mentioned a mortgage that your parents probably have on your house. I have a mortgage on my house to pay for me living in that house and hopefully ultimately be able to pay that off. It's basically a contract between the issuer, in this case Keller ISD, and a borrower or investor, excuse me, an investor that's willing to lend the money to Keller ISD to take care of their needs, and then you pay interest on that bond to make it worthwhile for that investor to invest those monies. As I mentioned, every other school district in the state of Texas, at least, goes through this process in order to take care of their facilities needs. Regardless of what district you might think of, any district you can think of has to have the way the rules of the game are with regard to Texas school finance. They have to have bond elections to go through major capital or building projects. Just a few basic terms. Mr. Young's mentioned principal and interest. Principal is the amount that you borrow. Interest is the amount that you pay in order to have the ability to borrow that principal. The term is the length of the borrowing. And then an example there at the bottom, if we borrow $10 million in principal over a 20-year period at a 4% interest rate, that bar graph at the bottom shows level payments, and the blue would be the principal that would be paid off each year, and the green would be the amount of interest that's paid each year. So your total debt payment is not just what you borrowed, but also the interest that you paid. In terms of the process that Keller ISD went through, you see a bond election, it passes, and you price it, but there's a whole lot of things that happen in preparation of that. This probably oversimplifies it. But what typically happens, and what has happened in Keller ISD, is I think that the board and the administration identify that there's probably a need for some facility improvements or new facilities. Rather than have a top-down approach and tell the community what they need, I think they very smartly put together a Citizens Bond Advisory Committee. And I believe the Keller Advisory Committee had over 200 people that volunteered their time, I think over 8 meetings, probably over an hour and a half each meeting. Once again, volunteered their time for the betterment of the community, and they get the same information or inside information that the district has, and then they make recommendations as to what they feel is needed and what may not be needed. So it's really a great thing that the Citizens Committee does, because once again, it's on their own time. Typically, in this case, the Citizens Advisory Committee makes a recommendation to the school board. The school board then calls for the election. A lot of legal hoops to jump through in terms of calling that election, but ultimately the election's held. Hopefully the voters would vote for it. In this case, for Keller ISD, they did. So now the district was authorized to sell up to $315 million in bonds. The team members, the financing team members, are chosen by the district. The underwriting firms ultimately sell the bonds. The investors, they find investors to loan the money to the district. The money's then delivered to the district, and then the district starts construction. So this probably oversimplifies it, but this gives you an idea of how the process of actually leading up to calling for the election, holding the election, and ultimately pricing a bond issue works. After the election, like I mentioned, you have a financing team. Some of the folks are represented on this stage. Financial advisor Hilltop Securities is my role. Bond counsel Chris Settle with McCall. Part of Chris's job is to work with the Attorney General to make sure that everything is done legally. Underwriting syndicate, the Piper Sandler folks are here, and you can see other firms that are involved with the underwriting syndicate that sold the bonds. They have an attorney that has to make sure they're doing everything legally. Over on the far right, all the bonds are rated by Moody's and Standard & Poor's. I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's important because that gives the investor an idea as to the credit quality of a Keller ISD bond. The paying agent registrar bank is the bank that sends an invoice to the district and it ultimately collects the money for the payments and then sends those payments to the actual bondholders. And then credit enhancement, one of the nice things the state has done is, on top of the district having a solid credit rating that I'll show you in a second, but you also get a state insurance policy that allows for the bonds to be rated at the highest level, which means that the district gets the best interest rate because they're high credit quality. And you see in the middle Keller ISD. So as Mr. Young showed you kind of his job, and Dr. Westfall as well, they wear a lot of hats. In other words, they don't just have to know about how to educate kids and how to work with principals and campuses. They've also got to be able to work with financial folks, with legal folks, with underwriters, with all sorts of different people in order to make sure that the district's getting the best deal that they can get. Kind of the role of what I do, and this talks more about kind of during the bond election process. I mean, at the end of the day, I work with and advise the district on anything bond election or authorization related. We have to establish what the goals are. Mr. Youngs and I talk on a very frequent basis, and when I got a phone call probably in early 2019, the thought was, okay, how much can we afford to do? We certainly have needs of a certain amount, but how much can we afford to do? We'd like to be able to do it without a tax rate increase. So we started to put together projections on when we're talking about a 25 to 30 year financing or bond issue. We have to not only know where are we now in terms of the tax base. He mentioned property taxes, but we have to have an idea of what we think the district's property tax base is going to do for a lengthy period of time, so that we can make projections on what the interest in sinking fund or bond tax rate is going to be, and hopefully and certainly be able to keep the promises that the board and the administration have made to the voters who are going to vote for the bond election. So we put together tax rate projections. Also, since it was early last year, we don't have any idea of where interest rates are going to be. So we have to make projections on where interest rates are going to be as of a week ago, or a couple weeks ago, back on January the 8th. So roughly last February, we're making interest rate projections and kind of trying to estimate where interest rates might be. And then lastly, we're making structure and term recommendations. We talk about what the projects are that are included in the bond issue, because we don't want to finance iPads over a 25-year period, because those iPads are going to be gone probably in 3 to 5 years. So we try to structure the financing so that we're paying off all of the projects over their useful lives. In terms of after the election passes, what I do is work with the district on putting together everything related to the pricing itself. And so we prepare documentation. We coordinate with all the other service providers, and you can read all of this down there. The prospectus that we put together is called the preliminary official statement. We work with bond counsel, we work with the rating agencies, and ultimately conduct pricing of the issuance. Probably hard to see, but this is kind of a summary going into the election of where we felt the amount that we can do up there at the top left, $315 million, a 27-year term financing. We were using rates of about 3.4%. We're using kind of a rainy day fund that the district has for bond debt service of about $18 million. And once again, this is the projection. And we felt like we could do this for a 34-cent INS tax rate, which is the rate that the district currently has. So we weren't going to go up on the tax rate. The graph shows, the blue line shows what the district's debt service or INS tax rate would have done without the election. And then the green line shows with the election and everything else that the district has outstanding, that would be the tax rate. And you can see that we're not increasing above that 34 cents. And then also you see a dip in the tax rate, so that at some point in time in the near future, if there's a need, the district can look at the potential for another bond election. When we started this process, there was the thought that we might do 2 or 3 bond issuances of this $315 million, meaning we might do 100 the first year, 100 the second year, and 115 the third year, for example. In this case, we ultimately decided to issue the entire $315 million, and the reason why is because what this graph shows in the background is what long-term tax-exempt interest rates have done all the way to the left since 1981. And believe it or not, in 1981, the tax-exempt interest rates were over 13%. If you go all the way to the bottom right, you can see that we're at the lowest interest rate levels that we've been in a roughly 40-year period. And so knowing that, the thought is that we would go ahead and do the entire $315 million at one time, lock in an extremely low, historically low interest rate, and give the district the opportunity to invest those funds and earn extra dollars to help out with some of the projects that the district's working on. And then the blue graph just shows what that index has done the last year. I mentioned bond ratings. Just like individuals have a credit score or a credit rating, you probably see, if you're at 800, that's a great credit score. If you're an individual, same thing for school districts and quite honestly other borrowers or issuers in the tax-exempt bond market. And so we participated with the district, with Mr. Young's in rating calls with Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And once again, he has to wear many hats and be able to answer all of these questions that are shown there on behalf of the district. If you look over there at the bottom right, those are the different ratings, AAA being the best. The higher the rating, the lower the interest cost, because what the investor does is they look at that rating and say, hey, if they're at AAA, then my money's pretty safe. If you're at under BBB, that's considered junk, they're going to get a higher rate because their money's probably not quite as safe with that type of issuer. And then I mentioned that permanent school fund, which is the state insurance guarantee. That in and of itself allows for the bonds to be rated AAA. So I'd highlighted the Moody's and Standard & Poor's over on the right. The AAA ratings are the PSF ratings. On a standalone basis, Keller ISD's ratings are AA2 and AA. So on a standalone basis, the district is two notches from the highest ratings that you can have, which are excellent ratings. In terms of the pricing, just to kind of summarize it, there on the left is kind of my attempt at a cover of that preliminary official statement, a $315 million issue, the players that are involved. The top right shows the principal and interest structure of this $315 million. It might look strange on a standalone basis, but when you combine the total debt service at the top with the total debt service of the district that you had prior to this issuance, it's reflected on that bottom right. So on the bottom right, the blue debt service is the debt service that was already outstanding before we did this issuance, and then the green is this $315 million issuance. So that is the Keller ISD structure right now, and you can see that there's capacity built in for the future. And then this is, you saw the projection previously on where we thought rates would be, the structure and everything. In column 3 there, the ultimate interest rate was 3.127%, and I will tell you in my 24 years of doing this, that's about as low as I've seen on a 27-year issuance, and I think that was reflected in that graph I showed you earlier, that we were at the lowest interest rate environment of my lifetime, and certainly your lifetime as well. So the timing of the district was wonderful. We're using a little bit less in terms of that rainy day fund dollars projected to use, and then we're going to once again stay at 34 cents. And then lastly, I know you can't see this, but a lot of what I do involves a lot of spreadsheet analysis. So you guys, if you're doing projects in Excel, do as much as you can, because I've, over the course of my 24 years of doing this, this is probably the program that I use more than anything else. I know there's other software out there, but we use a lot of Excel analysis. So if you're good at Excel, you're putting yourself in a good position to do something like I do. But ultimately what this does is shows the tax rate projections that we used in column 3, existing debt service in column 4, the principal and interest structure in columns 6 through 8, and then ultimately the tax rate calculations over in column 12. So that those numbers that you see in column 12 match the lines that you saw on some of those graphs on prior pages. Are there any questions on anything I mentioned? Yes, ma'am.
What functions do you do most often in Excel?
What functions do I do most often? I will tell you, it's still a lot of arithmetic, but a lot of algebra. I mean, a lot of times we're dealing with unknown variables that we have to solve for. My son's in the 8th grade, and I'm shocked at how much algebra I recall in helping him, because I do use it on a daily basis. But I mean, we're using some functions, we're using concatenate functions, we're using a lot of different functions in order to come up with these calculations. But I will tell you, a lot of them are algebraic functions, and it's kind of funny because my 8th grader says, well, I'll never use this. I'll never use this, and you probably are in a lot of classes that you think, well, I don't need to know this, and it's amazing how much of that you may ultimately need. So a lot of algebraic functions and calculations that we're doing. Good question. Yes, sir.
So how much for one bond and how much can I expect paid back?
Okay, very good question. And Kit and Keith, they'll talk about it a little bit as well, but the bonds, and I'm sorry, the gentleman asked how much does it cost for one bond and how much can you expect to get paid back as a bondholder? And so each bond is sold in $5,000 increments. So you and I would be classified as what they call retail investors, where we would buy maybe $5,000 at a time. There's also institutional investors, which are big insurance companies or companies that have a lot of cash that'll buy much more than $5,000 at a time. And I will tell you, in this environment, as I mentioned, with the interest rates as low as they are, you wouldn't get much interest back. So it's a great deal for the issuer. It's what I would call a borrower's market right now, because interest rates are so low. There are interest rates on, as I mentioned, the structure of the issuance. There's some bonds that are paid back in the first year. There's some bonds that are paid back in the 27th year. So if you bought a bond in the first year, the interest that you would be paid would be much less and a lower interest rate, because your money's not being put to work for as long. Whereas if you were to have a 27-year bond, you might get 3 or 3.5% on that bond itself. If you're at 1 year, you'd probably only get 0.5%. So you wouldn't get quite as much interest the shorter your investment is. The longer it is, it would be higher. But once again, in this market, I would say that Keller ISD is the big winner in terms of paying such a low interest rate. However, there are still investors out there that want to own Keller ISD bonds and bought Keller ISD bonds. And the amazing thing is, as Mr. Young's mentioned, $315 million in bonds were sold in 90 minutes. I mean, that's pretty quick for $315 million, but that's how the financial markets work and how these pricings work. A very good question. Any other questions? Thank you all very much. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Why would anyone invest with bonds at such low interest rates whenever it's barely keeping up with inflation?
That's a wonderful question as well. Believe it or not, a lot of these companies, like these insurance companies, they are required to invest their money. Their money has to be invested at all times. They have to be invested in very safe investments, in which Keller ISD is. So, believe it or not, their investment policy, if you will, is that they have to always have that money put to work into something. And the only way they'd earn more money is if they were to put it in risky investments, which they don't want to do. So at the end of the day, there's still going to be demand, and quite a bit of demand, for a safe investment, even if it's yielding an extremely low interest rate. But that's a great question. Any other questions? Thank everybody for staying awake.
It might be instructive for you to know that the largest holder of Keller ISD debt is State Farm. State Farm owns about 1/4 of our debt. So in the past, we've done ratings calls with Standard & Poor's and Moody's. We've had a ratings call once with State Farm. They just wanted to know what's going on in Keller, what our balance sheet looks like, what our growth looks like. So insurance companies need to have their dollars invested. State Farm is one of our largest investors. Go ahead, Kristen.
I'm going the wrong way. Am I going backwards here? Oh, there we go. All right, I'm Chris Settle. I'm with McCall Parkerson Horton, and we are bond counsel for Keller ISD, and we've been bond counsel for a really long time, since before I even became a lawyer. As Jeff mentioned, we represent the district on the legal side throughout the process of the bond issue. We help with the bond election, and then we help with the bond issuance, and we really don't come into play until the district, we get a call, hey, we're going to call a bond election, and then we help figure out what the proposition language is going to read, how it's going to read, and we prepare the bond, the election order, and all of the other documents relating to the election. And we also advise the district as to the Texas ethics rules, and so there are a lot of rules. They're a little different before the election's called as opposed to after it's called. Before it's called, district officials there can be some advocacy for or against the election because technically there's no election yet. But after it's called, district officials cannot advocate for or against, so they can't, in their official capacities. So Mr. Youngs couldn't go out to the supermarket and say, hey, vote yes, this is a good bond. You have to, tone it down. Otherwise, you could get in trouble with the Texas Ethics Commission. And also, school district funds, resources cannot be used to, advocate, only factual information. And once the election's called, the state law requires the district to publish and post notice of the election. In Keller ISD's case, because it's in Tarrant County, it has to be done in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. There are only 2 or 3 counties in the state that have to publish in Vietnamese. That increases the expenses a lot. And so they published in the 4-Star Telegram, posted notice in multiple public locations, and also posted all of the polling locations. And so we help guide the district through that process and make sure they fully comply with state law, because if they miss a step, that could be an issue after the election. And then the election's held, and then we prepare the canvass order. And once the district canvasses the election, there's a 30-day period that runs. And if the district did miss a step or if they did something wrong, a citizen, a registered voter, could file an election contest, and they have 30 days to do that. In this case, Keller did everything, didn't miss any steps or do anything wrong. No election contest was filed. So once 30 days pass after canvass, the election is incontestable, and the district can move forward with approving the bonds. And so once the canvass period, once it's canvassed, we start working on the bond documents and work with Jeff on the schedule and all that. And so then the district, in this case, in December, adopted a bond order in which they didn't actually sell the bonds, but they delegated the authority to the CFO, Mr. Youngs, and also to the superintendent to finalize the sale of the bonds. And so they set, in this bond order, the Board of Trustees said, okay, you as pricing officer, you can finalize the sale of the bonds, but the bonds, the interest rate on the bonds cannot be above this rate. The final maturity date cannot be past this date and can't be more than this principal amount. And so then the district works with Jeff and Hilltop and then the underwriters to find the best time to get into the market. And that's how we get the great rate we got on these bonds, is because of this delegated sale. They didn't have to do it on the date the board met. It was just on any date that they could get into the market and get a good rate. And we also negotiate the terms of the bond purchase agreement with the underwriter just to make sure that it's beneficial. It basically benefits both parties. Everybody's working towards the same goal in these deals. It's not adversarial at all. It's not like most forms of the law where people are fighting, and like in corporations, two corporations are trying to get what's best for them, each one. In this case, the districts, school districts, they work with the underwriters, and so that everybody is happy in the end, as opposed to most, when you think about most legal like negotiations, it's one's happy, one's not. In this case, everybody's happy. I'll be honest, that's one of my favorite things about being a bond lawyer is, in the end, everybody is in a good mood. And then Hilltop, they prepared the offering document, the preliminary official statement. So we review that, or I'll review that and make sure that it accurately describes the transaction and accurately reflects all the legal documents, such as the bond order and all the others. And then, once the bond's priced, I send a transcript. In this case, there are about 15 documents that I sent down there, including all the election documents and then all the bond documents. And that transcript is down there right now. I'm expecting to hear back from them in the next, if not by tomorrow, first part of next week. And what they'll do is they'll send a preliminary approval letter that says, hey, everything was good. We're signed off, we'll release our opinions. Or they'll say, hey, can you make this change or that change or whatnot. Typically, we receive clean P letters. And then once they approve the bonds and they issue their approving opinion, the bonds become incontestable under state law. And at that point, we're good to close the deal. In addition to the state law issues, we help the district with making sure they comply with the federal tax laws so that the bonds can maintain their tax exempt status. One of those deals is the district has to spend all the money within, either spend it or have it under contract to be spent within 3 years of the date the bonds are issued. And so we work with the district, we go through a federal tax questionnaire and, just dot all our I's, cross all our T's, and just keep it on track with the IRS. And we help the district file the tax documents with the IRS, so the IRS has on file, these are tax exempt bonds. And then in the end, as bond counsel, we render a bond opinion to the effect that the bonds have been authorized, issued, as you can see on the slide, and delivered in accordance with state law, and that they constitute valid and legally binding obligations of the district. And also, we give an opinion that the interest on the bonds is excludable from gross income, so they're tax exempt. And this is an opinion that's basically priceless to the district, because if anything happens, they can say, hey, they can point to us and say, you gave this opinion, and this is on you. So we shoulder that burden, so that's why we have to be, it's a very detail-oriented legal practice. If you really can't, if you miss anything, even the smallest thing could cause problems. So to be able to give this opinion, it takes a lot of, it's very thorough work. That's pretty much it for me. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Okay, so you know how that tornado destroyed those campuses in Dallas ISD last year?
Yes.
Well, Dallas had just got done a bond election and they had that money, but they had used it to help rebuild some of those schools.
Okay, so she's asking if the tornado that destroyed the Dallas schools, some of the Dallas schools, if the district could use bond funds to fix them up, even though I guess if it wasn't part of the bond, package that was approved. And it all depends on the way the proposition was drafted. If it was a general broad purpose for construction, renovation, improvement of school facilities in the district, then yes, they could. They would, they would have to probably set aside or push back other projects that were in the original bond plan. But they could use it for that, just depending on the way they drafted the proposition. And also, as long as they didn't officially adopt a list of projects, if the board of trustees if they had adopted an order saying these are the projects we're going to do with the bond funds, they would have to do those first. But if they just had the general language, they could push others back and do that. Yes.
But could we do that with our bond? If that were to happen in Keller ISD, the way our bond was written?
You could. The district, yeah. Yes.
Would it be legal for some of us to buy bonds, though? Teachers, some of the students, maybe?
Yes, I could even buy the bonds if I wanted to. Yeah.
I mean, this might be positive, but there'd be any smaller amount of $5,000 I think.
Well, he's asking if Keller students or teachers could buy bonds, and if there's anything lower than 5,000 increments, but for each bond is 5,000, so you'd have to have $5,000 to invest in it, I believe. I mean, that's, yeah, you could get a pool and buy one, as a group. That's always an option. Yes.
So if we did buy those bonds, would we have to pay tax on the interest that we make on it because it's a missing bond?
There, you would not have to pay tax on Keller ISD bonds. And that's another thing that makes the fact that they're tax exempt makes them, it increases the attractiveness, because say you have a 2% or 3% interest rate, that's tax exempt. So what you're actually getting back is, the return is higher than that, because it would take depending on your tax bracket, for a 3% tax exempt, I mean, I'm just ballpark, I mean, that'd be 4% on a taxable. So if you were to buy, a corporate taxable bond, you'd have to get a higher rate to actually get the return that you would on a tax exempt bond. Anything else? Yes. Well, I guess through the final maturity of the bonds. But once, I mean, it's our opinion lasts through the life of the bonds. And then once they mature, it's over in the IRS. They wouldn't go back and they couldn't go back and say those should have been taxable. It's basically they have the statute of limitations is if they want to deem a series of bonds taxable, but ours runs through the life of the bonds. We've never had to deal with it, but my guess is our liability would be the difference between the taxable rate versus the tax exempt rate. Any other questions? Okay.
We're going to wrap this thing up. My name is Kit Caldwell. I'm with Piper Sandler. This is my associate Keith Dash with Piper also. We've had the good fortune to work with Mr. Youngs in the district for quite a while now. Piper's been around for about 100 years. We've been in Texas for over 20 years, but in 2015 we made a major talent hire. We added Keith Dash here to our team. Keith is he went out of state for his undergraduate degree. He's got a master's of finance from UT, but maybe the most important thing about Keith is he's a graduate of Keller High. And I believe this was your middle school, or your?
Yeah, this was my intermediate school. So this used to be the South Keller Intermediate School, and since been converted. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So this was my intermediate school. It used to be South Keller Intermediate Ski, and it was since converted. But I used to go to school here. So.
And Keith is going to handle the technical parts of our presentation, as he should. So a little bit about the working group here. So you all have seen the same team here. We're part of the underwriting syndicate, Piper Sandler. We were fortunate enough to have a really good syndicate that worked with us. BOK Financial, RBC Capital Markets, Raymond James, and Wells Fargo were part of this syndicate with us. You know some of these names. Piper, our name may not be kind of a household name to you guys, but in what we do, this is what we do. It's K-12. We're the #1 underwriter. In most ways that you can track it in Texas. We've worked with a lot of the other peer school districts here. I'm sorry. We've worked with a lot of different your peer school districts here, the Louisville, the Fighting Farmers, and those folks, and Denton ISDs and others. And I'm going to have Keith kind of take over this next portion here, talk about the roles.
I'll try and talk into the mic, but so what is an underwriter? What is our role as an underwriter? And essentially what we do is we stand as the intermediary between parties who need capital. So in this case, Keller ISD went out and called a $315 million bond election that they needed to raise funds for. And we stand in the middle between issuers and parties that need capital with parties that have capital. So investors, it might be somebody like your parents who are saving for retirement and they have the money today, but they would, instead of using it, like to invest it, potentially grow the capital and use it at some point in the future. So we serve as kind of the intermediary between those two groups. We have tons of relationships with investors, and so we have good relationships with lots of the issuers and school districts in Texas, and so we're kind of there in the middle of those, and we kind of have three roles as an underwriter. The first is to, we've got these bonds, we're going to trade this money from the investors and give it to the issuers for these bond certificates. And so the first thing that we need to do, going back to the question from earlier, is we need to set that price. We need to figure out what each of these bonds is worth. The second thing that we need to do is use those relationships that we have with the investors and find those investors. So we've set these prices for these specific bonds. We now need to go out and find investors for these specific bonds that Keller ISD is trying to sell. And then the third thing that we do, probably one of the most important, is we then stand there in the case that, say, Keller needs $315 million in bonds, but we can only find investors for $300. We then stand there as kind of the lender of last resort, put up our capital and then basically fill the rest of the capital needs that Keller ISD might have. So what exactly is this bond? So we've got this bond certificate. And Jeff touched on this a little bit, but essentially a bond certificate is a payment today in exchange for future payments. So a stream of cash flows in the future. And there's lots of different types, there's different terms, so anywhere from essentially 1 to 30 years. And there's different coupons that you can have. You can have all the way, from low 2% coupons to 5-6% coupons on some of these bonds. And then you have different durations. So this one matures, in our example here, in 4 years. So kind of walking through our example, we have a buyer of a $1,000 bond. And this bond has a coupon of 5%. And real quick, they're called coupons. Back in the old days, everything's electronic now. But back in the old days, what you had was you would actually get a physical certificate when you purchased a bond. And you would, at the bottom, you would clip off this little thing called a coupon, and you would take it to the bank. And instead of nowadays everything's electronic, you would take this coupon to the bank, and in exchange, you would get your interest payment. So if you had, say, a 10-year bond over 10 years, you would go and take these coupon payments to the bank, and you get your return of capital. So that's just some history on the name, but our coupon here is 5%. So $1,000 times 5%. In our example, essentially in year 1, you're going to get $50, year 2, $50, year 3, $50, and then year 4, you get another $50 of interest, but you're also going to get your return of capital. So this $1,000 bond is actually, over the life of the 4 years, going to pay $1,200. So what is the price of a $1,200 stream of cash flows? Well, for that, is anybody here familiar with the present value of money, or the time value of money? Is that a concept you guys have heard? No? So essentially what it means is $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. So why is that? So the biggest reason for that is something called opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is essentially, you have $1 today, and you can invest that $1, and over time, if you put it in a CD or something, it will grow. And when you go to get it in the future, that same $1 is now worth more money. Whereas if you just had $1 in the future, some static time in the future, say 4 years, it would still just be worth that $1 at the time you receive it. So $1 today gives you the opportunity to invest it, and therefore $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. And that's basically the theory behind present value of money. And if you guys get into, go on to get degrees or work in finance or business, you'll hear this term a lot. But essentially what it is it's the way that we calculate the price on these bonds. So again, back to our example, we've got this stream of $1,200 over the life of the 4-year period, discounted back to today using this formula, and I don't know if you guys can see this here, but essentially this $50, we're dividing it by 1 plus then that yield of 5%. So today, $50 is worth $47.62 if we were to receive that in 1 year. And if you kind of progress along, you can see $45.35, $43.19, and then at the end you get $41 plus that return of principal in 4 years, which is then discounted back. The yield here is our discount rate. So essentially what we've got is we're discounting at this yield over these 4 years. When you add them all up together, this is a $1,000 present value. So in the case of these bonds, this would be the price. So if an investor were to go out and buy this very specific bond, it would cost them $1,000 today. So what determines the interest rates on bonds? And some of this has been touched on a little bit, but credit rating. It was mentioned that Keller ISD has a very strong credit rating. And because of that, they have lower interest rates. So their bonds aren't as risky. And so when buyers buy their bonds, they're pretty sure that they're going to get their cash flows back. But if you were to look at a company like, say, an Uber or another startup that were to go out and issue bonds, well, those bonds are pretty risky. And investors are going to want to be compensated for the fact that they're putting their capital at risk with the off chance that they might actually not get it back, or they might not get all of those cash flows back that they're investing for. Keller ISD had something called the PSF program, so they had bond insurance, which they already had a strong underlying credit, but this PSF program boosted it a little bit and just gave investors some assurance that Keller ISD is not going to default on their bonds, but just in case we've got this bond insurance, that is there to backstop, any chance that their capital wouldn't be returned. For Keller ISD, their credit rating is really strong, but some of the other school districts in and around Texas have lower credit ratings, so this PSF program is extremely important to them. Security type. So Keller ISD, they issued general obligation bonds, so that essentially means that the revenue was coming from taxes. But there's other types of bonds out there, revenue bonds. So if you think of something like NTTA, that's a toll road. So you go through a toll, you pay a fee, and that fee, a portion of it goes to reimburse bondholders. Sales tax. So you buy something at the store, you pay 8% sales tax. A portion of that is then used to reimburse bondholders. The ballpark in Arlington that's being built for the Texas Rangers right now, a significant portion of that is being built with sales tax money. We touched on this earlier, taxable versus tax exempt. Chris mentioned that taxable rates have to be higher because investors want to be compensated for the fact that part of their interest is going to go back to the federal government in the form of taxes. Maturity. So the closer you are to receiving your capital back, the lower rate that an investor will require. Going back to our Uber example, if you were to look at a 1-year bond, Uber is probably going to be around in 1 year, so you're pretty sure you're going to receive your cash flows. But if you were to buy a 30-year bond from Uber, there's a lot going on in that company. It's potential that there's a potential there that you might not receive either all of your cash flows or potentially the return of principal there at the end. So investors are going to require a higher rate as you get closer to maturity, and so basically the further out you get there, the higher the rate. Coupon. Some investors, we've mentioned like insurance companies, they like specific coupons, whereas a retail investor, someone like your parents, might require a different type of coupon, and that has to do with, that affects the yield that these bonds require. And then market conditions. So there's a couple things here. Investor demand. So we issued the Keller bonds right after a couple holidays. So we had Hanukkah, we had Christmas, we had the New Year's. And so there really wasn't any investor demand kind of leading up to our sale because investors were off with their families, on vacation, and issuers were doing the same thing. So there was really no investor demand during that period. But fast forward to the week of our sale, and they had all returned. The demand was back. So that can influence essentially what rate you pay. New issue volume. So we issued our bonds. We looked out at the market and we said, all right. So El Paso ISD was pricing their bonds the day before ours. And we didn't want to go up against that, and they didn't want to go up against us, and so we looked at some other transactions that week. And what we were doing is we were trying to essentially say, all right, we want investors to be completely focused on our bonds during the day of sale. So other new issue volume that can compete with our bonds, that's similar credits, similar, there are other school districts. We want to have as little competition as possible. Geopolitical conditions, as we'll get to here in a second, our sale was during essentially the crisis that we had with Iran and the attack that we launched in Iraq. And so that was something that investors were very focused on around the time of our sale. And then the general economy. The interest rates have been historically low. A lot of that has to do with the Federal Reserve keeping them low. And so essentially, it's kind of backwards, but for municipal issuers, when times are good, rates are typically high. And so when times are bad, rates are lower. And that has to do with just how the economy affects interest rates. But unfortunately, sometimes in this industry, bad things happen, ends up being good for bond issuers. And then one more thing to kind of keep in mind. With bonds, there's a couple different components that are constantly moving, but basically, what we want to keep in mind is price and yield move inversely. So the price of the bond that you would have to purchase it for affects how the yield reacts. So the price going up is good for an issuer of Keller ISD. That means when someone buys their bonds, Keller is receiving more capital for that same bond. But what's happening at the same time is the yield is going down for that price to go up. So what's happening is investors are getting a worse deal. So just keep that in mind, that price and yield move inversely, and we'll see some examples of that here in a second. So I touched on this, the week of our sale, El Paso had just priced. But before that, we really didn't have much to look to. So, you know, the school market, the school bond market, is somewhat of a commodity, and you can kind of peg what Keller ISD is going to get for their yields generally by looking at some other transactions that are similar that have priced recently. But when we priced ours, like I said, we came out of a couple holidays, basically 2.5 weeks of very low volume. But on top of that, another thing that was going on is our sale was on January 8th. On Friday the 3rd, the U.S. launched a drone attack in Iraq, which killed the Iranian general, which set off kind of a kettle peg of just a couple things happening from there. So on Saturday, Iran, there were protests in the streets, and then they vowed that they would retaliate. On Sunday, the president came out and said, if you retaliate, we're going to retaliate. Then the week of our sale kind of started, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the financial markets. So leading up to our sale, I have on here Wednesday. It was Wednesday over Iranian time, but it was actually Tuesday night, I think around 8 o'clock local time, that Iran retaliated. And what they did is they launched, I'm sure you guys are familiar, they launched a couple of missile strikes at some of our bases over in Iraq. And so that was right before our sale, but we didn't really know how the president was going to react. So, the financial markets, if he were to say, all right, you retaliated, I told you I was going to retaliate, and now I'm going to, the financial markets would have gone one way. But if he just said, okay, limited damage, and this is what he ended up doing, and just kind of letting it go from there, it would go a different way. The financial markets would go a different way. So what happened is, and Kit can probably speak to that, but Kit and Mark and Jeff, they got on a call and they talked. All right, this just happened. We don't know how the president is going to react. Should we continue with the bond sale? And I think ultimately what was decided was interest rates are just so low. This is a strong credit. We're very confident that we're going to get a good deal. Still pricing the bonds, despite the fact that then it was learned during our sale, the president was going to actually address the nation.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but in the bond market, turmoil is good for us. It sounds bad, but when there's, you hear the terms thrown around on the financial shows, the flight to quality. Well, the flight to quality is to treasuries, municipal bonds, and it pushes the yields down. And in having conversations with Mr. Youngs and Jeff Robert, the night of those attacks, it was like, well, sadly, it's terrible this is happening, but this is a good time for us to be in the market that next day. So we made the decision, and the desk, everybody made the decision to go into the market that morning.
So kind of getting into the sale, what this is, and Jeff showed this as well, but this is something called a preliminary official statement. And essentially what this is this is an advertisement to investors. So it's got lots of details about the sale. It's got things like how much par we're going to issue, where we're going to issue the par in terms of the maturity structure. What are the call dates? It's another feature of the bonds. And it's also got some background on Keller and some projections of what Keller is expecting. So it's got financial information, it's got demographic information, it's got security for the bonds, so how are these bonds being repaid, just lots of information in here. And so what we do is we put this out. This was actually put out on December 30th, about a week before the sale. And what it does is it gives investors some time to think about it and look into it. And it also gives them time, if they want to reach out to us and ask any questions that they might have. So, like Kit mentioned, we decided that we were going to go into the market, and so on January 8th at 9:30, we decided, all right, we're going to start that 90-minute order period. And what this is this is a release wire. So this it's essentially like the preliminary official statement, but it's got a lot more, hardened facts now. So it's got, all right, we know that this par amount is going to be in this maturity, and we know even what the coupon and the yield are going to be. And so it goes through all of the different maturities and it gives you that information. So now investors know, all right, if I want to buy these bonds that are due in 2035, what is the price that I have to pay? And so they take this document and then they're introduced to something that looks like this, which is called game day, we'll get to in a second. And they can go in and then through our underwriting desk place orders for these specific maturities. But before we get into that, I just want to make one distinction. So there's kind of two types of orders. There's a priority order and there's a member order. And the priority orders are essentially what we're looking at. These are the orders that they have investors behind them, and they're good investors. They're investors that we, like the State Farm that was mentioned. They're investors that have bought the bonds before, and they're probably going to buy the bonds again in the future, and they're going to hold these bonds. They're buy and hold investors. Another thing about these orders is if we have, say, $1 million in par in one maturity, but we have $5 million in orders in the same maturity, we can use these type of orders, these strong priority orders, to then leverage investors against each other to then drive that yield down for the client and by driving the price up. So the other type of order is a member order. So a member order or a stock order is essentially, a lot of times these orders are placed by the co-managers. They're kind of the orders of last resort. So we've got, say, $10 million in bonds, we have $7 million in priority orders, $3 million in member orders. If there were no other orders there, we might use these to fill it. So getting into the order period, and what we're going to do here, we've got 90 minutes, and I'll go quickly kind of through these, but essentially we've got 5-minute screenshots. And what we're looking at here is on the left-hand side, on the bottom left, you can see those are some of the investors that are placing orders. And on the right side, those are the members of the syndicate. So at the top, you've got Piper Sandler, the lead underwriter, and you've got the co-managers. And so just kind of keep that in mind as we flip through. You'll be able to look at those and see how they change over time. But
just point out the goals.
Yeah. So essentially, these are the bonds that we have to offer. So we've got bonds up front that are smaller in terms of size, and then out long we've got these big 2-term bonds. And what we're trying to do as we go forward is we're trying to fill these up. So at a minimum, we want to fill these up with the blue, which are the priority orders, which would mean, all right, we have investors for all of the bonds that Keller needs to issue. Even better would be to fill it up and then go over that, say 5 times over that. So we have 5 times the investors that we do bonds to offer. And then at the end, we would be able to, like I said, negotiate with the investors to reduce the yields because we had such strong demand for our bonds. And it's kind of like an auction is what it is. By having a whole bunch of people compete for the same bonds, we're driving that price up. And again, price and yield move inversely and driving the yield down for Keller ISD. So this was 5 minutes in, a couple orders trickled in, but 5 minutes later, we had a whole bunch of orders. And essentially what happened is the deal was substantially done, other than a couple term bonds out long at this point. And so, we're looking at the blue again. When I say that it was done, we're looking at the blue, the priority orders that have filled up these maturities. But we're not done there. That doesn't mean we're going to stop. We're going to keep going and, like I said, build up on that oversubscription so that at the end we can leverage the investors against each other. 5 minutes later, some orders continue to trickle in. One thing to keep in mind, this was at 9:30. The president was set to speak and essentially tell the country whether we were going to retaliate or not at 10 o'clock. So investors were a little bit on edge. We had the transaction pretty much, for the most part, done within 10 minutes, but we did want to keep building orders. But at the same time, we had the president set to speak. So it was a very interesting pricing. We have pricing sometimes where orders kind of trickle in from the start, and by the end, it's a pretty straight line up. But this one, it was a lot different with the president set to speak. I think a lot of the orders that we did get right in the beginning were to kind of jump in front of what the president might do. So continuing on, orders just kind of trickled in. You can see as I flip forward. So right here, we're at 1 hour and 4 minutes left. So 25 minutes in the order period have passed. And I switched the screen here. You can see that the red and the blue are gone, and instead we have a blue and a teal. And what we've got here is the kind of the typical blue on the bottom. Those are the senior manager orders. The teal color that we have, those are the co-manager orders. And you can see that the senior manager had most of the orders at this point, and that makes sense because the senior manager is kind of there to spearhead the transaction. The co-managers are there to support the transaction. But we also have, as the senior manager, the most liability. So we're kind of in charge running this transaction, and so the orders tend to reflect that. On this screen, not many orders are trickling in at this point, but I kind of wanted to give you a couple views. This one is those same orders, but now it's broken out by investor type. So we've got, bond funds, insurance companies, institutional, just all different types of orders. And I don't know if you guys can see that, but we've got a little legend up top. We just wanted to give you, kind of a picture into, there's a lot of different types of investors competing for the same types of bonds. So this screen here, what we've done is we've turned off the member orders. So this is essentially how the senior manager views the book of business. So we're very focused on those priority orders that we can use to leverage investors at the end. And also, when we have these gaps here on these term bonds, those are spots that we're looking at and saying, okay, maybe that's a spot where we'll need to underwrite bonds or put our firm's capital up to support the transaction. So again, we've got 50 minutes left in the order period. I've turned back on member orders. So we did get a couple orders at this point, a couple significant orders, $25 million from BlackRock in the 2044 maturity, which pushed that blue level close to that top level, the amount of par that we had. And the reason for that is some of the details around the president's speech seemed to surface at this point. So what he ended up doing was we de-escalated the situation, and so investors, I think, got light of that, and they started to feel a little bit more comfortable investing. Again, orders slowly trickled in. Seems like some of the details continue to emerge. At this point, we had 2 large orders. So we had 2 $30 million orders for those term bonds that we were very focused on from Invesco. So 35 minutes left in the order period. The president was actually supposed to speak with an hour left, but he was a little late coming to the podium. So we had, kind of this gap, not only where he was supposed to speak, but this point where he was delayed and we were waiting on him, and so were investors. But with 30 minutes left, the president got to the podium and he started speaking. And the orders essentially stopped at that point as everyone kind of was glued to the TV. Couple orders kind of came in. The only orders that we got during the speech were actually from a co-manager that was just placing those stock orders or essentially backup orders. The president's speech concludes, we're going to de-escalate the situation, and so from there, the investors return. So you can see that last term bond, 2044, is completely done at this point. Term 2047 is nearly complete. It's still got some red kind of there at the top that we need to turn blue. And again, a couple orders trickled in, 15 minutes left, 10 minutes left. And this is essentially, even though we have 10 minutes left, this is essentially where the book of business was left at when the order period was over. And I'm going to stay at this screen because the other ones have the member orders included, but this is what our book of business looked like. So these are the priority orders that as a senior managing underwriter we were very focused on. So there was one little maturity up kind of in the middle of the curve, but mainly the long 2047 maturity is where a lot of the par was that wasn't accounted for. And so what we did was we kind of have a couple options here. We can increase the yields, which would make the bonds more attractive, and investors would likely step in, but that's not good for the issuer. So what we did instead was we committed our capital. So we committed about $25 million of our capital, bought Keller ISD's bonds, and gave something called a verbal award after a couple changes. And instead of increasing the yields, we actually just committed our capital. And so this page here, I kind of mentioned we have 3 jobs as an underwriter. We set the price, we find the investors, and underwrite the capital. Well, part of setting the price after you find the investors is adjusting the price. So if you look at the yellow column off to that far right, you can see priority times subscribed for. So those are those blue orders. We've got 5 times, 3 times, 5 times, 9 times, all the way up to almost 11 times for some of those front and middle maturities. And so what we did was we had so many investors, again, it's kind of like an auction, we were driving up the price. We had so many investors competing for those same bonds that we were able to drive down the yields, which is in that orange column. You can see by as many as 9 basis points, we lowered the yields and essentially created a better deal for Keller ISD. And there's always a risk there that you go to these investors, they wanted the bonds at this price, but then you tell them, no, the price is higher now, that they have the opportunity to walk away. So it's a careful balancing act that our underwriter does. We don't want to increase the yields by too much that we lose all of our investors, but he's pretty experienced in that, and he did a good job with this one. The other thing to look at the very bottom, the 2047 maturity, you can see it's only 0.8 times subscribed for. So that one, you can see the change is 0. What we did is, again, I mentioned we committed our capital. So instead of increasing the yield, we just left the remaining yields unchanged, so 36 on, and underwrote balances in a couple of those spots. So real quick, this is the order summary. Over on the left graphic, we have the orders by investor type. So bank trusts, SMAs are something called separately managed accounts. There's money managers, there's stock orders, which are those member orders. And then on the right side, we've got the allotment. So who actually got the bonds? You know, we had a lot more orders than we did bonds, so the allotments are where the bonds actually went. So kind of summary, we had 193 orders totaling $730 million in par. 502 million of that was priority, so 155 of the orders. And then 38 of the orders, or $229 million, were member orders or stock orders. And so that's kind of the order period. I wanted to touch on one more thing. We only issued $279 million in par, but we've mentioned a couple times that we had an election for $315 million. So there was this big gap there that we were able to fill with something called premium. And so back to our bond equation, what we had, if you look at, say, a 2021 maturity. So we've got a 5% coupon. So for every $1,000 bond or $5,000 bond, we're going to receive 5% in interest, but prevailing interest rates aren't 5% right now. Prevailing interest rates, as was mentioned, are a lot lower. So for the 2021 maturity, they're 0.96 basis points or 0.96 96 basis points or 0.96 of 1%. So because the investor is receiving a coupon, a semi-annual or annual coupon payment that's a lot higher than prevailing interest rates, they have to pay a premium for that. So they have to pay a little bit extra upfront to get those higher than market interest rates. And so we've got par, in the 2021 maturity, we've got par of $9 million. And the premium that those investors had to pay on that $9 million was about $369,000. So even though in 2021 we issued $9 million in par, we actually were able to generate proceeds of $9.3 million. And so once you net out expenses, you've got a total of $317 million in proceeds. Once we net out expenses, you can see that's how we arrive at the $315 million, which was the full election amount. And I think that's it. So that's kind of our order period and the role of the underwriter. Does anybody have any questions on that? Yeah. I'm sorry? Did we go over? No. So we're legally restricted because We're legally restricted because the election was for $315 million. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, can we go over $315 million? And the answer is no, because the election was $315 million. We were legally restricted to that amount. The citizens within KCAL-A ISD that voted on the bond said you can only issue up to $315 million. Any other questions? Yeah.
So what's the advantage of issuing the bonds at a premium versus just issuing them at par?
So there's several advantages there. I don't want to get too into it, but one of the biggest things is if you think about it like a house. So with a mortgage, you can go out and say in 10 years, you might have a mortgage for 6%. And in 10 years, prevailing interest rates are really low like they are now, and you can potentially refinance that house. So prevailing mortgage rates are, 3.5%, 4.5%. So you could go out and you can refinance those. Kind of the similar story with bonds. A 5% coupon, you could potentially, in 10 years, there's something called a call date on there. And this is starting to get a little technical, but in 10 years, the issuer will have the right and likely will be able to go out and refund those bonds. So even though we've got debt service of X today, the likely debt service in 10 years, if we're able to refund these bonds, could be substantially lower. And that's because that prevailing 5% coupon that we've got is higher than rates will likely be in 10 years as we roll down the yield curve. I know I'm getting technical here, but essentially if you think about where we are on those maturities, we said that the further out you get, the higher rate you have to pay. Well, today a 30-year bond in 10 years is only a 20-year bond. So lots of different factors play into that, but the higher the coupon, the more refundability you have. Another thing, sometimes we'll do a 2% coupon or a 3% coupon versus a 5% coupon because that's what the investors want. And so we know that we have $10 million in orders for a 2% coupon, but we'd only have $500,000 for a 5% coupon. So there's several different factors at play, but without getting too complicated, I think probably a good answer is investor preference. Anything else? Is Mrs. Folger in the house? I was told she might be here. No? Okay.
I'll tell her you said hi.
All right. I was going to give her a shout out, but.
Yeah, she deserves it.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Youngs. Did you have anything else to say?
If there are no other questions, we are dismissed. Is that correct, Rob? Do you want to make a closing remark here? Thank you for coming this morning. I'd like to thank my friends up on the stage that helped us conduct this piece of business.
Thank you, Mr. Youngs. Ladies and gentlemen, we really appreciate you coming to this. We hope this was informative for you. Like I said, we have live streamed this on YouTube. There'll be a video going back to your classes. Your teachers may want to sit down with you and go over some things that may have been a little more in depth. We can do that. But if you would, please meet with your teachers here in just a minute. We'll see when your buses come, and we'll get you out by campus when your buses come in, okay? Thank you all so much. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you for your help.
So much. Okay, we'll get to work.
Thank you so much.
We so appreciate you guys doing this. Thank you. Appreciate it. You look like holding in code. We'll definitely give a shout out. No worries.
You want to have them stay seated until Janelle's going out there to
We said we do dismiss. I'll just get another thing.
Okay, I just didn't know.
Guys, go.
Good to see you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's go and stay in this room until your buses get here, please. Adults, you're good. Now, the security guard won't have to tell us. She'll tell me who's here, and then we'll send everybody out.
Dr. Wright, the front bus is going high. Actually, both of them.
So one?
Both 1 and 2, both color high.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first two